Ariel Castro, the suspect in the ghastly abduction of 3 Cleveland women, reportedly wrote a suicide note in which he confessed his crimes, yet blamed the victims for being kidnapped. Cleveland police have yet to confirm the existence of this document. However, WOIO investigative reporter Scott Taylor says he has seen the handwritten note. Joining us to discuss this is Robert Seiden. He's president of Confidential Security and Investigations, Robert Seiden, and trial attorney Richard Roth. Robert, you are an investigator. Police say they have removed 200 items from Castro's home. From your experience, what do the police do with all this stuff?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, they have to make sure it is documented as evidence, crime scene evidence, so that if there is a trial in this case, they can introduce it into evidence at the trial and make sure that the chain of custody and such is followed. But importantly, it'll really give a blueprint, if you will, as to what had gone on in this home, this house of horror, if you will, over the last 10 years. Because you have the testimony of the victims, that's going to be the primary evidence, but you're also going to need to have circumstantial evidence and other evidence as well, which this evidence that they're getting now is going to be a very important part of that.
So this is very much a part of building the case. Does it ever happen that they do all this digging and they do all this searching and they don't find what they're looking for, or they don't find anything that helps kind of seal the deal on circumstantial evidence?
It could be, but not in this case. My sense is here, because it was a surprise to the defendant that these folks were rescued. He probably didn't have enough time to cover his tracks or get rid of evidence, so it's more than likely that they're going to get some good stuff out of this. That's my bet.
Absolutely. I want to pull up some tweets here that are coming in. Scott Taylor, of course, the reporter from WOIO, says, just got a copy of a letter written by Ariel Castro in 2004. Cops found it in his house. He says, I am a sexual predator. I need help. That's certainly damning. He says, Castro writes, they are here against their will because they made a mistake of getting in a car with a total stranger. Again, sort of on the one hand, acknowledging that he's a kidnapper and did something illegal, but also sort of shifting some blame and saying they got in a car with a stranger. Castro writes about wanting to kill himself and, quote, give all the money I saved to my victims. Ariel Castro says in the letter he has no bad feelings for the bad things. He has no feelings for the bad things he has done. Castro writes he was surprised how young Gina De Jesus really is because he thought she was a lot older. When we see these types of tweets, Richard, when we see the level of admission and still the kind of delusion attached to the admission, do we see an insanity defense in the mix here, in the making?
You know, that's the first thing that someone wants to go to when you really don't have much else to draw from. But there's really not much of an insanity defense. This was going on for 11 years. He took 3 different women at 3 different times, and he held them in his basement with chains. I don't really see the insanity defense being played here, nor do I see it working. You have game over. You have an admission, which is game over. You have these 3 wonderful women who went through literally a living hell. One's 23 years old. That's Mr. Jesus. One who's 30 and one in the late 20s. It's pretty gruesome if you read some of the reports, especially one from the New York Times today. So I don't see an insanity defense. It seems like
Richard, I mean, I'm just a regular Joe here, but when I think about the level of just absurd evil attached to kidnapping and torturing and abusing and assaulting people for over a decade, then I combine that with those tweets, those admissions. It's sort of hard for me not to see this as insane. Can a sane person do this?
Yeah, I hear you, but the insanity defense essentially is based on the fact that the person did not have the intent, did not have the requisite mens rea, we call it in the criminal law, to do that. And it's tough because it essentially becomes a battle of the experts. And I don't believe for a second that he's going to be able to prove that he didn't intend to do this. Remember, this guy worked. He worked as a bus driver. That means that every day when he went to work until he was fired in November, he locked them in chains. He went to work. He came back. As gruesome and as crazy as it sounds, he's going to have to show that he didn't have the requisite mental state to do that.
Let me add something to that as well. It's a very good point you're bringing up because it's a very important distinction that you got to make clear, which is that there's it's possible for someone to be mentally ill or to suffer from some kind of sociopathology, which this guy clearly suffers from something, and being able to have a valid insanity defense, as Richard was just saying. Insanity defense in every state is different in terms of what you have to establish. In New York, for instance, you have to establish a person didn't understand or appreciate the nature and consequences of their acts. There's a whole litany of standards that you have to overcome in order to prove it. It's very, very difficult to prove. But just because you're mentally ill doesn't mean you're acting under the guise of being insane at the time you were committing the act. And this guy clearly, that's not rational behavior, what he did. His tweets are very telling in that if you've studied or read anything about people who engage in these types of aberrant behavior, even serial killers or people who engage in sociopathic behavior or psychotic behavior, they sometimes feel this strange dichotomy of guilt about what happened, so therefore they almost want to get caught. They want to feel like the police are going to catch them, and they sometimes leave evidence so that they can get caught because they feel guilt about what happened. On the other hand, they feel conflicted because they blame it. The basis for the underlying crime, they blame on the victim.
On the victim, which is exactly what we're seeing here. Guys, I want to move on to another story which is just as tragic and has had just as many devastating impacts on the nation. Today, police revealed that Boston Marathon bombing suspect Tamerlan Tsarnaev was secretly buried in an undisclosed location outside Worcester, Massachusetts, after a frustrating week-long search for a community willing to take the body. They didn't reveal where the body was entombed. Richard, Rob, police say they have spent thousands protecting his body at the funeral home. Is this unprecedented?
I think it's unprecedented because you really don't have a terrorist who has lived on our soil, to my knowledge, who has to be buried in his hometown. You have a tremendous amount of political pressure. Could you imagine being a local funeral home and accepting a person who literally had this pressure cooker go off at the Boston Marathon? So I've never heard of such a thing. Certainly 9/11 in New York, that wasn't the case. Other defendants who have been caught. I don't see that being the case. So it's a toughie. It's a very tough call. A lot of local people do not want to have this guy buried in their neighborhood.
You know, you got to also look at the political and the perception aspect of what happened here, because just like when bin Laden was caught and we had the ceremony where they buried him at sea, and they made a big deal out of conveying that in the media, that America is a nation that will fight back and will sustain these kind of losses. But on the other hand, we won't become the savages that the people are who attack us. We're not going to stoop to their level. And by showing the respect here that this guy doesn't deserve, by holding on to his remains and treating it with dignity and holding on to the cost of having to find a place for him, that shows that America, despite the fact that other nations and other peoples might have just discarded this thing in a pit or something, and not giving a damn about it, we still treat human remains with dignity, because that's the kind of nation that America is.
All right, there's another dimension to this, and that is that the Boston Marathon bombing suspect that's currently in custody, his brother Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, has told authorities that his sister-in-law Catherine Russell played no role in the April 15 blast. Guys, authorities continue to watch Russell anyway. What are they trying to find?
You know, it's novel that a wife doesn't know what a husband's doing.
Yeah, right.
What are they trying to find? Listen, this is an exhaustive and expansive investigation. They want to find anyone and everyone who had anything to do with this absolutely horrific bombing in Boston. So if she had anything to do with it, you're darn right that the government wants to nail her. The problem so far is that apparently there's no indication. They thought they had DNA of a woman. The DNA was not of her. It was not her DNA. She did work apparently 70 to 80 hours a week in healthcare. And so they're trying hard, and they may find something. In this investigation, as much as it's the unfortunate acts are over, the investigation is continuing. But so far, they've really come up with empty on nailing her.
Is it safe to say that if there is a shred, a scintilla even of evidence that she's connected to this, that they're going to find it? I get the sense they're going to be digging and trying to make connections for the next 5 years if they can.
She's the only person right now who is the direct connection between both the deceased and the other suspect who's still alive, that is an adult and that had been in contact with them on an ongoing basis leading up to the attack. It's as a law enforcement person, it's hard for them to swallow that she had no clue. And so they're trying to find out how far back she goes, how much does she know, and they probably go through her phone records, they're probably going through her emails, and they're going to find anything they can to show a connection, because every piece of evidence
they
could
may
be
go
valuable.
through her elementary school homework assignments, man. I mean, they're going to dig here. This was an awful crime, and I think they're going to do everything they can to bring everybody involved to justice. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us. It's always good to have your insights. Up next, Dick Cheney has some suggestions for Republicans regarding Hillary Clinton.